There is a shallow rock shelter carved into the high desert of central Oregon. You would walk right past it. There is nothing about it, nothing visible from the surface that would tell you what was buried underneath. And yet what archaeologists pulled out of that ground does not fit inside the timeline we have been handed. It does not fit inside the story of how humans first arrived in North America, and the deeper the excavation went, the more the official timeline started to crack. Stay with this, because by the end, you are going to be asking a question that nobody in the mainstream seems to want to answer. Not just who these people were, but why the timeline keeps getting pushed back, further and further every time someone digs deep enough. The site is called Rimrock Draw rock shelter. It sits just outside a small town called Riley in the high desert of central Oregon. And serious excavation work began there in 2011. The team leading the project was based at the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History. What they found would, within a few years, force a fundamental reassessment of human prehistory on this continent. But before we get to what they found, you need to understand what the official story was. For a long time, the dominant model said the first humans in the Americas were the Clovis people, a culture identified by their distinctive fluted stone spear points, and they arrived roughly 13,000 years ago. The story went like this. A land bridge called Beringia connected what is now Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. Sea levels were lower. The two continents were physically joined. People walked across. Then, as the ice sheets retreated, a corridor opened between two massive glaciers, and those early migrants moved south through that gap and spread across the continent. That was the model, settled, agreed upon, and taught in schools. Then, the corridor got complicated. Studies began showing that this ice-free passage likely did not open until somewhere between 11 and 12,000 years ago, and even after it opened, it was essentially uninhabitable for centuries. No food, no resources, no reason for people to push through it, which means if humans were already present in North America before that corridor opened, they did not use it, and the evidence for earlier presence kept accumulating. Sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania and Cooper's Ferry in Idaho started producing dates around 16,000 years ago. 16,000! Thousands of years before the Clovis model said anyone should have been here. The explanation the academic community reached for was the Kelp Highway hypothesis, the idea that people traveled by boat along the Pacific coastline, navigating through rich marine ecosystems of kelp forests, seals, and shellfish. It is a reasonable theory. It fits some of the evidence. But then Rimrock Draw started producing numbers that made even that explanation feel like a placeholder. The first major discovery was animal remains, specifically fragments of camel teeth and jaw. Now, the instinct is to think that sounds wrong. Camels in Oregon, but it is not wrong at all. Camels evolved in North America. This continent was their original homeland before they migrated to Asia and Africa, and eventually went extinct here at the end of the last ice age. The species at Rimrock Draw was Camelops hesternus, sometimes called yesterday's camel. These were not small animals, 7 feet tall at the shoulder, close to 1,800 pounds, and critically, these were not the remains of an animal that wandered into a cave and died. The bones showed deliberate markings, cut marks, and signs of butchering. This animal was processed by human hands. Now, in archaeology, the next question is always about time. When? And this is where the volcanic ash enters the picture. The camel teeth were found beneath a sealed layer of ash, and that ash is identifiable. It came from an eruption of Mount St. Helens, not the 1980 eruption, but a far older, far larger event known as the Set S eruption. That eruption occurred more than 15,600 years ago. Whatever was beneath that ash had to predate it. The ash was a locked door, and everything below it was older than 15,600 years. Radiocarbon dating of the camel tooth enamel came back with a number 18,250 years before present. The term before present, or BP, is calibrated against the year 1950, used because nuclear testing after that date began contaminating the carbon-14 levels that dating relies on. That's 18,250 BP. That is the number that science returned. But here is what the official conversation tends to gloss over. That date comes from the camel tooth, and the camel tooth was not found at the bottom of the site. It was found above other artifacts, stone tools, scrapers, buried even deeper in the sediment, deeper in the ash, below the camel remains. Under the law of superposition, a foundational principle of geology, the oldest material in undisturbed layers is always at the bottom, which means those tools are older than the camel, potentially significantly older. The tools themselves are worth pausing on. They were crafted from orange agate, a material that does not occur naturally in the basalt walls of that shelter. It had to be carried in. Someone selected it deliberately, transported it to this location, and used it to make precision cutting instruments. One of those scrapers was subjected to residue analysis, a process that checks for preserved ancient proteins trapped in the microscopic fissures of the stone. The result was bison blood, not modern contamination, ancient bison blood from Bison antiquus, the larger prehistoric ancestor of the modern buffalo. So the tool was used to butcher not one species of megafauna but at least two, camel and bison, at a site in Oregon during the height of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets were at their thickest and ocean levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. The question is not just who these people were. The question is what we are not being told about them. Think about what this site actually requires us to accept. Humans were present in the interior of North America, not on the coast, not in a transitional zone near a land bridge or a kelp highway, but deep in what is now the Oregon Desert, 18,000 years ago at a minimum. If the tools below the camel remains are ever directly dated, that number could climb toward 20,000 years or beyond. 20,000 years. That predates the Clovis culture by 7,000 years. That is not a minor revision to the timeline. That is a fundamental structural collapse of the model. And here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because the Clovis first model was not just a working hypothesis, it was defended aggressively for decades. Researchers who presented pre-Clovis evidence were dismissed, marginalized, and told they were misreading the stratigraphy or contaminating their samples. The academic machinery around this question was not neutral. It had a position, and it protected that position. The question worth sitting with is why. Why was so much institutional energy spent holding that date at 13,000 years? Who benefits from a compressed human timeline in North America? Consider what an older timeline implies. If people were here 18 to 20,000 or more years ago, then the history of human civilization on this continent is vastly longer than the model acknowledges. It means entire cultures, entire peoples, entire chapters of human experience existed here and have left almost no trace in the official record. Not because they did not exist, but because nobody has been looking in the right places, or perhaps because the right questions have not been allowed to be asked loudly enough. The mainstream explanation for the absence of evidence is simply that much of the coastal route these early people supposedly traveled is now underwater. Sea levels rose significantly at the end of the Ice Age. Whatever camps, shelters, or settlements existed along the Kelp Highway are sitting under hundreds of feet of ocean. That is true. That is a real limitation. But Rimrock Draw is not on the coast. Rimrock Draw is in the interior, at high elevation, in a desert. If people were already that far inland, already that established, already selecting specific non-local materials for tool-making and processing multiple species of megafauna, they were not recent arrivals. They were not a thin vanguard of explorers still clinging to the edge of a continent. They were a people who knew this land. The other piece of this that deserves attention is what the tool selection tells us about cognitive sophistication. Orange agate is not the closest material available at that site. Basalt is right there in the walls, but these people bypassed the local material and specifically sought out a stone that fractures conchoidally, meaning it breaks like glass, producing sharper cutting edges. That is not random behavior. That is accumulated knowledge tested over generations, passed down and refined, the kind of knowledge that requires time, stability, and continuous occupation of a region. Not a brief transit, not a desperate migration, a settlement. And yet here we are, 2025, and the question of who first arrived in North America is still technically open. The site at Rimrock Draw continues to be excavated. More of those deeply buried artifacts will be dated. Some of those dates may be even more startling than what we already have, and when they come back, the conversation will either expand to accommodate them or contract to minimize them. It has done both before. The archaeologists involved in this project argue that 18,250 BP is a minimum age, not a fixed date. A no earlier than marker, not the actual arrival. The actual occupation of that shelter likely stretches back further. How much further is a question the sediment may eventually answer, but only if the excavation continues, only if the funding holds, and only if the results are allowed to be heard over the noise of a model that has been defending itself for decades. What is buried in Oregon is not just camel teeth and bison blood. It is a version of human history that is older, longer, and more complex than the one we were given. A version where the story of this continent does not begin 13,000 years ago with a corridor of ice and a population of hunters moving south. A version where the beginning is much further back, much harder to see, and for reasons worth thinking carefully about, much harder to find. The timeline keeps getting pushed back every time someone digs deep enough. Rimrock Draw pushed it back again. The only real question is how far it will go before the official story finally has no choice but to change. And when it does change, what else changes with it? What do you suspect? Give me your thoughts in the comments and like and subscribe to our content so we can bring you more mysteries from history's dark corners. Share this with someone who loves history and keep watching this channel because the questions Rimrock Draw raises are only the beginning.